Okay. So, a lot of you have been sending in some pretty interesting stuff lately. And it seems like there's a lot of questions about just how strong is the American consumer, right? Like, what's going on? How are people spending their money? Are we seeing changes?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question.
So for this deep dive, we're going to dig into some recent reports that are hinting that maybe things are slowing down a bit, that maybe U.S. consumer demand isn't quite as robust as it was. We've got a whole bunch of different insights from business execs, retail, travel, even the discount retail sector. And, we'll tie that together with some of the economic indicators that we've been watching. So really what we're trying to do is, figure out what are the most important signals in all this material, like what's got these guys concerned, and, how does that connect to the bigger picture of the economy?
Right.
All right, so let's jump in.
So I think, as you go through these reports, one of the things that kind of jumps out at you right away is the sort of change in tone from these business leaders, right? And it's not even just the companies that, you might expect to be having a little bit of a harder time, but you're seeing CEOs from some really big, important companies that have generally done quite well, sort of expressing this real caution about the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about some pretty significant, consumer-facing businesses, right? So the material highlights folks, at the very top, like at Walmart, Dick's Sporting Goods, so retail there, huge airlines like, Delta, United, American, Southwest. Yeah. And even, discount retailers like Dollar General. So, yeah, that's a pretty broad lens on what's going on, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think when you start to look at, what they're worried about, it gives you some really valuable clues. So, for example, when the CEO of Walmart says, hey, we're expecting profit growth to be a little bit slower than usual, that tells you something pretty significant about consumer spending patterns, right? Because Walmart is so big, they've got customers everywhere, and they're in all these different parts of the economy. So when they're feeling a little bit nervous, that kind of signals something bigger might be happening.
And it wasn't just like this general feeling of things slowing down either. I mean, the airline industry, which, obviously we saw this huge rebound after the pandemic, they're now really adjusting their expectations. So, Delta's CEO specifically called out that he's seeing weakening consumer confidence and that's actually having a real impact on their bookings. And then you've got, the head of United saying that there's been this really significant drop in government-related travel, which then is kind of spilling over into leisure travel as well. And, even American Airlines is saying some of this is, because of this safety incident they had. But even with that, they're still acknowledging these broader pressures on demand and this decline in that government travel, too. So it's clear that I guess, unprecedented travel boom we saw after the pandemic is definitely starting to lose some steam. And, this is across the board, both leisure and business travelers, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. So, we're hearing these very specific concerns from, some big players. So then I guess the next question is, well, what does this tell us about the overall health of the economy, right? Like, what's going on there? And, based on these reports, it seems like whatever's driving consumer spending, it's facing some pretty serious headwinds right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. And these headwinds, it seems like they're coming from, a bunch of different directions. But one of the biggest ones has got to be tariffs, right? I mean, the expectation is that all these new tariffs on good coming from China, Canada, and Mexico, that they're going to make things more expensive for everyone, like just higher prices when we go to the store. And we've already been dealing with so much inflation.
That's right. I mean, inflation has been a really persistent problem, and these tariffs, they're just going to make things even harder. It's basically like adding another tax on top of everything else. So, when you think about it, a tariff is really just a tax on goods that are coming in from other countries. And businesses, they don't just absorb that extra cost, they pass it along to consumers in the form of higher prices. So what ends up happening is people just can't buy as much with the same amount of money anymore.
And it's not even just, the cost of buying stuff going up. The reports are also pointing to, some kind of early signs that the job market might be cooling off a bit. Like job growth is slowing down a little bit and unemployment's ticked up just a tiny bit. And, that's got to play a role in how confident people feel about spending, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Job security is super important when it comes to consumer confidence. If people aren't sure about their jobs, they're naturally going to be more careful about how they spend their money. And, the data in these reports actually backs that up. In February, we saw this pretty big drop in consumer confidence. It was actually the biggest drop since 2021. And then consumer sentiment in March was worse than anyone was expecting. So, when we talk about consumer confidence, we're really just talking about how optimistic or pessimistic people are feeling about the economy, right? And when that confidence takes a big hit, it's a signal that people are worried. And when they're worried, they're less likely to spend money on things they don't absolutely need.
And, what's kind of crazy is that, even air travel, which a lot of folks thought was going to be pretty insulated from all of this because of all that pent-up demand, after everyone was stuck at home, even that's starting to soften. So, it really seems like we could be looking at a pretty broad decrease in consumer spending across a bunch of different parts of the economy.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the fact that both leisure travel and business travel are slowing down, that kind of suggests that this pressure on spending is really pretty widespread, right? So that initial surge in demand that we all saw after the pandemic, that's definitely starting to fade. And it looks like the combination of inflation and this, kind of overall economic uncertainty, it's even impacting areas where consumers were really prioritizing spending before.
Right. And it's also interesting to see how different retailers that are catering to different kinds of consumers, how they're viewing things. So the reports talk about Walmart, for example, and how they're expecting their customers to start focusing more and more on essential goods, just the basics. But then you have Dollar General, where their CEO is talking about how the financial situation for their core customers is actually getting worse, and they're having trouble even affording the necessities. So, it really shows that we've got this kind of two-speed economy happening, right? Like, it's impacting different people in really different ways.
Yeah, definitely. That divergence is super important because it shows how uneven the impact of this current economic climate is. So, some consumers might still have some spending power, but even they're probably going to be a lot more careful about what they buy, right? They're going to be looking for value more than ever before. But for those core customers of discount retailers, it's a much tougher situation. It really indicates that budgets are getting tighter, especially for people at the lower end of the income spectrum.
And I think, this overall caution that we're seeing from businesses and the fact that consumer demand might be slowing down, that has some pretty big implications for the entire economy, right?
Yeah, totally.
Like the reports even talk about how the stock market dipped earlier this year, and there are concerns about a possible recession. So,
for sure. Consumer spending, it's one of the biggest drivers of the U.S. economy. So if consumers start pulling back, it's going to have this ripple effect. It's going to impact company revenues, investment decisions, and eventually it could even impact overall economic growth. So, earlier this year, we saw a lot of optimism from investors and business leaders, but now they're getting more worried about things like tariffs and changes in trade policies. And that really reflects this, underlying concern about the economy as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's right. But, it's not all doom and gloom, is it? There are some bright spots in the reports. Like there are companies like Dick's Sporting Goods, ELF Beauty, and Abercrombie & Fitch. They're actually feeling pretty optimistic about the second half of the year. So it's not like everyone's convinced things are going to fall apart.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not all negative. I think there's definitely still some pockets of optimism out there. Or at least, some companies are expecting that the pressure will ease up a little bit later on this year. But overall, I think the dominant feeling is still one of uncertainty. Businesses are really trying to figure out how these tariffs are going to play out in the long run and, what direction is the economy headed. It's a tough situation to be in.
Right. The CEO of American Eagle put it really well. He was talking about this fear of the unknown, how tariffs and inflation and potential government cuts, how all of that's leading to consumers being a lot more conservative with their spending. It really does seem like businesses are navigating like a really uncertain landscape right now.
Yeah, I think that feeling of uncertainty is really widespread. And, that makes it so much harder for businesses to plan for the future. They might hold back on investments. They might be more hesitant to hire new people. And that could actually end up contributing to a slowdown in the economy, too.
Right. So, okay, let's try and tie this all together for you. What we're seeing in all these reports is that there's been a pretty significant shift in how consumers are behaving. And business confidence, it's definitely taken a hit. It looks like this is being driven by a few different factors all happening at the same time. But, those new tariffs, they're definitely acting like this big new pressure point on top of all the inflation we've already been dealing with.
And I think it's super important to point out that this potential slowdown, it's not just impacting people who are already on a tight budget or, industries that have been struggling for a while. Even sectors like air travel that have been really strong are showing signs of slowing down. So that suggests that we might be seeing a much broader adjustment in how people are spending their money. And it's not just limited to one particular income group either.
So, given all of this, I think it's a good time to ask ourselves, what parts of our own spending are we paying more attention to now? Are there things we're cutting back on? And, as all these businesses are trying to figure out what's next, what are the economic indicators that we should all be watching to get a better sense of where things are headed? It's definitely a time to stay informed, keep an eye on the news, because things are changing pretty rapidly. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.